A title can make a woman a duchess, but only loneliness can teach her what the crown of that title truly weighs. Clara Bennet learned this on the first night she entered Blackridge Castle, with sea fog pressed against the windows like pale hands and the Atlantic striking the cliffs below with the sound of a restless heart. The wedding carriage had left her at the front steps just after dusk, its lantern shrinking into the mist before she could decide whether to feel abandoned or merely delivered. Behind her lay a chapel ceremony so brief and quiet that it seemed less like a marriage than the signing of a document. Before her rose the castle of her husband, Duke Everett Whitmore, a fortress of black stone perched above the main coast, its towers sharpened by wind, its windows dark except for a few trembling squares of candlelight. No music welcomed her. No flowers waited in the hall. No husband stood at the door. Only an elderly butler named Samuel bowed with careful sorrow in his eyes and said, "Welcome home, Your Grace," as though he were apologizing for the word home itself. Clara stepped inside with her gloved hands folded before her, the lace of her wedding gown brushing the cold marble floor. The great hall smelled of salt, old wood, and ashes long settled in fireplaces no one had troubled to wake. White sheets covered the furniture like sleeping ghosts. Portraits of dead Whitmores stared down from gilded frames, their painted eyes following the new Duchess with the silent judgment of people who had never needed to ask for a place in the world. Clara did not lower her chin. She had been raised in a house where debts whispered louder than prayers, where dignity was often the last coin left to spend, and she would not spend it cheaply now. Samuel led her up the broad staircase, past sunlit sconces and corridors where the sea wind slipped through cracks in the stone, sighing as though the castle itself were tired of remembering. "His Grace has left instructions," the butler said, pausing before a pair of carved oak doors. "He was called away on urgent business in Boston." Clara's heart gave one small, foolish movement, then stilled. "On our wedding night?" Samuel's expression tightened, not with surprise, but with the grief of a man who had expected the question and dreaded hearing it aloud. "Yes, Your Grace." He opened the doors. The Duchess's chamber was immense, beautiful, and lifeless. A fire had been laid but not lit. A silver brush rested beside a mirror clouded with age. The bed, too large and too perfectly made, stood beneath a canopy of dark blue velvet, untouched and cold. On the pillow, where a husband's hand might have rested, lay a sealed envelope marked with black wax and the Whitmore crest. Clara waited until Samuel withdrew. Only then did she remove her gloves, one finger at a time, and break the seal. The letter was written in a strong, controlled hand. "Duchess, Blackridge is yours to manage as title and custom require. You will find accounts in the West Study, household keys with Samuel, and sufficient funds for all necessary expenses. I ask only that you make no demands upon me that I cannot honor. You have been given my name, my protection, and my estate. Do not wait for tenderness from me. Blackridge has none left to give. Everett Whitmore." The room seemed to grow quieter after she finished reading, as if even the walls had leaned in to hear how deeply the words would wound her. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, the letter resting in her lap, the silk of her wedding dress whispering against the floor. Outside, waves broke against the rocks 200 feet below, again and again, patient in their violence, faithful in their return. She thought of her father's relieved face when the marriage contract was signed, of her mother's trembling smile, of every person who had looked at her that morning as if she were both fortunate and sacrificed. A duchess. A wife. A stranger in a dead castle. Her eyes burned, but no tears fell. Tears, she had learned, were sometimes mistaken for permission. Slowly, Clara rose and crossed to the hearth. The firewood was dry. The flint lay ready. Whoever had prepared the room had expected warmth. Someone had simply failed to begin it. She knelt carefully, struck the flint, and watched the first small flame catch like a secret refusing to die. Gold light climbed the stones, touched the bed, softened the mirror, and found the letter still open in her hand. Clara folded it once, then placed it inside the drawer of the bedside table, not as a treasured thing, and not as a wound to be revisited, but as evidence. Then she removed her veil, folded it with quiet precision, and laid it beside the candle. "Then I shall learn to live without it," she whispered. And somewhere deep within Blackridge Castle, beyond the locked rooms and covered portraits, beyond the grief her husband had left behind like dust, something old seemed to stir at the sound of a woman who had not come to beg for love, but who had not agreed to be buried either. By morning, the fire Clara had lit was nothing but a red-eye beneath a curtain of ash, yet it had changed the room more than any servant could have done. The chamber no longer felt entirely abandoned. It had been witnessed. It had been challenged. Clara, dressed before sunrise in a plain grey gown suitable for work rather than admiration, pinned her pale hair beneath a simple ribbon, and opened the curtains herself. Beyond the glass, the main coast stretched beneath a colourless sky, all jagged rocks, white surf, and dark pines bent inland by years of wind. The village of Ashbourne Cove sat nearly 2 miles below, its small roofs gathered around the harbour like frightened birds. Blackridge Castle stood above it all, not as a guardian, but as a warning. When Clara descended the staircase, the house seemed surprised by the sound of her steps. A maid carrying linens froze near the landing. A footman straightened too quickly beside a side table. Somewhere below, a door closed with the guilty softness of people accustomed to silence. Clara did not scold them. She understood fear when it wore discipline as a coat. Samuel waited in the great hall with the household keys on a silver tray. There were too many keys. Large iron ones for old doors. Small brass ones for drawers. A blackened key tied with blue thread that had been placed apart from the rest. Clara noticed it immediately. Samuel noticed her noticing. "The west study is open to you, Your Grace," he said. "The kitchens, the storerooms, the linen rooms, the chapel, the lower gardens, and all household accounts." Clara touched the blackened key with one fingertip. "And this one?" Samuel's face became still. "The East Conservatory. Is it damaged?" "It is closed." "That was not my question." For the first time, a faint, unwilling respect entered the old man's eyes. "No, Your Grace. Not damaged. Only forbidden." Clara lifted her gaze toward the dark corridor branching from the hall, where a row of covered portraits stood like mourners turned to the wall. "By my husband?" "By grief," Samuel answered quietly. That word did not echo. It settled. Heavy. Familiar. Clara took the tray without another question. The first days unfolded with the slow cruelty of cold rooms. At breakfast, only one place was set at the end of a table long enough for 20 guests. The silver was polished, the porcelain delicate, the coffee hot, and the emptiness enormous. In the west study, she found ledgers stacked in strict columns, rents unpaid, repairs postponed, fishing families charged fees older than their children, and staff wages reduced with mathematical neatness. No cruelty in the handwriting. That was almost worse. Neglect, when written politely, could pass for order. Clara spent hours reading until candle wax pooled beside her inkstand. She learned the names of tenants before she learned the names of the portraits. Mrs. Alder, the cook, had a son at sea. Thomas Reed, the stable boy, sent half his wages to a widowed mother in Portland. The chapel roof had leaked for 3 winters. The servants' wing had only 2 working fireplaces. By the 3rd evening, Clara understood that Blackridge Castle was not empty because people had left it. It was empty because those who remained had been trained not to live too loudly. There were rules everywhere. No music after sunset. No flowers in the great hall. No lamps lit in the east corridor. No mention of Miss Lydia Fairchild. No opening of the conservatory doors. No playing of a waltz called the Lantern Waltz, though Clara only learned this when her fingers brushed the dusty piano in the music room and every servant within hearing distance seemed to stop breathing. Was it hers? Clara asked Samuel later, standing beneath a chandelier wrapped in muslin. He did not pretend not to understand. Yes. And His Grace loved her? The butler looked toward the veiled portrait above the landing, a portrait Clara had not yet seen uncovered. More than he trusted life afterward. Outside, fog pressed against the windows until the world beyond disappeared. Inside, Clara moved from room to room with a candle in her hand, not opening what was forbidden, not yet, but counting the locks. A castle could hide sorrow. It could not hide rot. In the servants' hall, she found the fire nearly dead and 3 maids eating bread with cold fingers. In the chapel, she found rainwater gathered in a silver bowl beneath the leak. In the nursery, and used for years, she found a wooden horse with one broken wheel facing the wall as if ashamed of being forgotten. That night, Clara returned to her chamber with dust on her sleeves and ink on her thumb. She was tired in the deep, quiet way that left no room for self-pity. On the desk, a fresh sheet of paper waited. She took up her pen and began her first letter to Duke Everett Whitmore. She did not ask when he would return. She did not mention the cold bed or the empty breakfast table. She wrote of accounts, roof repairs, staff conditions, tenant hardship, and the need to reopen certain rooms for practical use. At the end, she paused over the signature. Clara Bennett was gone. The name had been buried in a chapel beneath vows that had sounded like business. Slowly, deliberately, she signed Clara Whitmore, Duchess of Blackridge. Then she sanded the ink, sealed the letter, and looked toward the dark east corridor beyond her door. Somewhere there, behind locked glass and old salt wind, was the room the house feared most. Clara had not come to disturb the dead. But she was beginning to understand that the living had been imprisoned in their place. 3 days after Clara sent her first letter, rain arrived from the Atlantic and laid its grey hand over Blackridge Castle. It did not fall in fury. It fell with patience, threading itself down the window panes, softening the cliffs, darkening the stone until the whole house seemed carved from wet morning. Clara spent the morning in the west study with the ledgers open before her and Samuel standing at a respectful distance, his hands folded behind his back as if he were guarding not papers, but secrets. "The fishing leases have not been reviewed in 6 years," Clara said, tracing one column with her finger. "Several families are paying rates set before the last harbor storm damaged their boats." Samuel inclined his head. His Grace preferred that old agreements remain undisturbed. Old agreements can become quiet cruelties when no one looks at them. The butler said nothing, but his silence had changed since her arrival. It was no longer dismissal. It was caution. Perhaps even hope, though he seemed determined not to let hope show its face too soon. By noon, Clara had ordered the servants' hall fireplaces repaired, approved new blankets for the east wing bedrooms, and requested a full list of every household member by name, wage, family circumstance, and years of service. Mrs. Alder, the cook, cried when Clara asked whether her son had returned safely from sea, then apologized for crying, then cried harder when Clara did not make her ashamed of it. "No one has asked after Daniel in months, Your Grace," she whispered, twisting her apron. Clara reached for the woman's flour-dusted hand. "Then Blackridge has been poorer than its accounts suggest." Word traveled faster than footsteps. By evening, the maids no longer vanished when Clara entered a room. Thomas Reed, the young stable-boy, bowed so deeply he nearly struck his head on a door-frame. Even the footmen watched her with a new confusion, as though kindness from a duchess were a language they had heard of but never expected to hear spoken clearly. Yet the castle resisted her. Not through people. Through memory. At dusk, Clara climbed to the gallery above the great hall, where the veiled portrait hung beneath a narrow arch. The cloth was black, edged with dust, fastened at the top with 2 silver pins. She had passed it each day. She had felt it watching through its covering, as impossible as that was. Samuel found her there. "That is Miss Lydia Fairchild," he said before she asked. His voice had lost its butler's polish. It belonged, for one brief moment, to an old man who had seen too much sorrow kept clean. Clara did not touch the veil. "She lived here?" "She was to marry him?" Samuel looked down into the hall below, where the first lamps were being lit. "Everyone believed so. She had a laugh that reached rooms before she did. His Grace was different then. Young in ways that had nothing to do with age." Clara stood very still. The rain whispered against the high windows. "What happened?" "A carriage accident near the eastern cliff road." 9 years ago this winter. She was leaving Blackridge after an argument. His Grace blamed himself. Then he blamed the house. Then he blamed any feeling strong enough to make a man careless. The words entered Clara quietly, but they did not leave quietly. They moved through her, finding the cold places Everett had left behind. She saw him more clearly then, not as a cruel husband, not entirely, but as a man who had locked every room that once contained warmth because warmth had failed to save what he loved. "And the conservatory?" she asked. Samuel's jaw tightened. It was hers. She grew white camellias there, even against the salt wind. After she was gone, His Grace ordered the doors sealed. He said nothing living should bloom in a place that had taught him loss. Clara looked toward the east corridor, where darkness gathered before sunset as if it had been invited. "That is a terrible sentence to pass on flowers." Samuel almost smiled. "Almost. Yes, Your Grace." That night, after the household slept, Clara walked alone through the castle with a candle sheltered in one hand and the blackened key in the other. She did not intend to open the conservatory. Not yet. But she needed to stand before it. The east corridor was colder than the rest of the house, its windows filmed with salt, its carpet faded where years of sun had once touched it. At the end stood tall glass doors framed in iron vines, their panes dark with grime. Beyond them, vague shapes crowded the shadows, dead stems, empty pots, a long table tilted under the weight of neglect. Clara lifted the candle. Her reflection appeared in the glass, pale and steady, a duchess by law, a stranger by welcome, a woman learning the architecture of another person's grief. Then something white caught her eye. Not cloth. Not bone. A flower. Small, bent, and alive in a cracked pot near the door. Clara drew in a breath. In that dead room, behind years of dust and command, one white camellia had survived. She pressed her palm gently to the glass. "So," she whispered, "you were not waiting for permission either." Behind her, somewhere deep in the castle, a board creaked. Clara turned, but the corridor was empty. Only the rain answered. Only the sea. Yet when she looked back at the glass, she saw more than a forbidden room. She saw proof. Blackridge was not dead. It had only been waiting for someone stubborn enough to notice its pulse. The next morning, Clara opened the servants' hall before she opened the west study. That alone was enough to make the household stop moving. A duchess did not usually descend below stairs before breakfast. A duchess did not usually stand in a room smelling of coal smoke, baked bread, damp wool, and tired hands. Yet Clara entered without ceremony, her grey skirts brushing the worn stone floor, the household keys at her waist sounding once like a small bell. Mrs. Alder froze beside the stove. Thomas Reed stood with a bucket in both hands. Two maids looked down at their aprons as if they had been caught stealing warmth. Clara saw the thin fire struggling beneath the grate, the cracked window stuffed with cloth, the long table scrubbed clean despite the age of the boards. Poverty, she thought, could live even inside a castle when no one important cared to look behind the green baize door. "Good morning," she said. No one answered at first. Then Samuel, who had followed her with the resigned expression of a man watching weather approach, cleared his throat. "Her Grace has asked to review household conditions." Mrs. Alder curtsied so quickly she nearly dropped a spoon. "We manage well enough, Your Grace." Clara looked at the woman's reddened hands, the cold breath of the maids, the boy's patched sleeves. "I was not asking whether you had learned to endure discomfort. I was asking whether it was necessary." Silence settled. Not offended silence. Unpracticed silence. The kind that comes when people are offered mercy and do not yet know if it is a trick. Clara walked to the window and touched the cloth wedged into the frame. It was damp. "This will be repaired by Friday." Thomas blinked. Mrs. Alder opened her mouth, then closed it. Clara turned to Samuel. "The servants' wing will have all fireplaces inspected. If the chimneys are unsafe, they will be fixed before any decorative work upstairs begins. The linen inventory will be reviewed. Worn blankets are to be replaced, not turned over and called new. Samuel bowed. Yes, Your Grace. A maid no older than 17 whispered. But His Grace always said unnecessary spending weakens a house. Clara's eyes softened. So does unnecessary cold. By afternoon, Blackridge had changed by inches. Not dramatically. Not enough for portraits to stop frowning. But enough. Workmen from Ashbourne Cove arrived to inspect the servants' wing. 2 fishermen came to patch the chapel roof before the next rain. Clara had the unused blue parlor opened, its furniture uncovered, its windows thrown wide despite the October chill. Dust rose in silver clouds. Sunlight, pale and reluctant, crossed the floor for the first time in years. In a locked cabinet, she found bolts of linen, ribbons, beeswax candles, and account books from before Lydia Fairchild's death. Everything had been kept. Nothing had been used. Grief had turned the castle into a museum of withheld breath. Clara ordered the candles distributed. That evening, for the first time since her arrival, the great hall held more than one light. Not many. 7. A modest rebellion. Flames trembled along the walls, touching carved banisters, brass fixtures, the edges of covered chairs. The house did not become warm. But it became less certain of its own darkness. Then came Lady Marjorie Vale. She arrived at Blackridge 2 days later in a polished carriage with red wheels and a footman in a coat too fine for the muddy road. She was a widow of excellent family, sharp cheekbones, silver blonde hair, and a smile that moved like a curtain before a closed door. Clara received her in the blue parlor, where the repaired window still smelled faintly of fresh putty. "My dear Duchess," Lady Marjorie said, letting her eyes travel over Clara's simple day dress. "How brave you are to begin improvements so soon. Some women would have waited for their husbands before rearranging a house that has belonged to his family for generations." Clara poured tea with a steady hand. Some houses cannot afford to wait for men who have gone away. The spoon against Lady Marjorie's cup paused. A very small sound. A very sharp one. "I only meant that Blackridge has always been particular. It has its customs. Its griefs. Its loyalties. Then I shall do my best not to mistake neglect for loyalty." Lady Marjorie smiled wider, and the room became colder around the fire. "You speak with confidence for a bride so newly placed. I speak with accounts in front of me and leaking roofs above me." Outside the windows, the sea wind bent the pines toward the cliff. Lady Marjorie set down her cup untouched. "The village is already talking, you know. They call you the new candle in the old tomb." Clara thought of the maids warming their hands by a repaired stove, of Mrs. Alder's tears, of the living camellia behind locked glass. "A candle is not insulted by darkness, Lady Marjorie. It exists because of it." For the first time, the older woman's smile faltered. Only for a heartbeat. But Clara saw it. That night, after Lady Marjorie's carriage disappeared down the cliff road, Clara returned to the east corridor. She did not unlock the conservatory. Instead, she placed one beeswax candle on the floor before the glass doors and lit it. The small flame reflected in every dark pane, multiplying itself until the dead room looked filled with distant stars. Clara stood there in silence, her white hand resting near the blackened key at her waist, and understood that whatever had kept Blackridge frozen would not surrender gently. The house had begun to breathe. Somewhere, someone would resent the sound. Far from Blackridge, in a private suite above Boston Harbor, Duke Everett Whitmore read his wife's first 3 letters beneath the clean yellow light of a hotel lamp and found himself more irritated by each one. Not because the handwriting was poor. It was graceful. Not because the requests were foolish. They were precise. Not because she complained. She did not. That was the part that unsettled him most. Clara Whitmore did not ask why he had left her. She did not describe loneliness. She did not wrap accusation in softness or plead for a return she had every right to expect. Instead, she wrote of broken windows, tenant leases, servant wages, chapel repairs, food stores, roof damage, and the need to reopen certain rooms for practical use. Practical use. Everett read those words twice, then folded the page too sharply. Outside, Boston moved in gaslight and carriage wheels, men calling along the docks, bells sounding in the damp evening air. The city suited him because it did not remember Lydia Fairchild. It did not contain her laughter in a hallway. It did not hold the shape of her hand on a conservatory door. It did not ask him to be the man he had been before the Eastern Cliff Road took her from his future and left him with nothing but a title, an inheritance, and a house that accused him every time the wind rose. His solicitor, Mr. Harlan Pierce, stood across the room with a leather folder under one arm. "Is there a difficulty at Blackridge, Your Grace?" Everett looked at the folded letter on the desk. "My wife has discovered the household accounts. That seems appropriate. She has also discovered opinions." Mr. Pierce was wise enough not to smile. "A dangerous habit in a duchess." Everett leaned back, his face unreadable. "She wants repairs in the servants' wing before work is done in the family rooms. She wants fishing rents reduced for families affected by last year's harbor damage. She wants the chapel roof fixed, the blue parlor opened, and candles released from storage as though wax were a matter of moral urgency. Is there reason to refuse?" There it was. A simple question. A knife without ornament. Everett rose and walked to the window, where rain silvered the glass. For months he had imagined Clara as a figure placed neatly within the boundaries of his arrangement. A wife in name. A duchess by law. Someone comfortable enough not to suffer, distant enough not to matter. He had given her safety. That was not cruelty. That was the cleanest kindness he had left. Yet her letters made Blackridge sound less like a preserved estate and more like a body neglected too long. "She has been there less than 2 weeks," he said. "And already people write to me about her." Mr. Pierce hesitated. "People?" Everett turned from the window. "Samuel says the staff have taken heart. The rector says the village children may soon have lessons in the old chapel room. A harbor merchant thanks me for the Duchess's intervention in storage fees, though I had no knowledge of any intervention. Mrs. Alder, my cook, sent a note asking whether Daniel Reed's ship might be assisted during repairs because Her Grace said Blackridge should not let loyal families sink quietly." His voice hardened on the last words, but the anger had nowhere honest to land. "She is making promises in my name. Or restoring meaning to it," Mr. Pierce said softly. Everett's gaze cut to him. The solicitor lowered his eyes at once. "Forgive me, Your Grace." Everett said nothing. He could have dismissed Clara's efforts as youthful vanity. He could have called it sentimental interference, the predictable restlessness of a woman left alone in a large house. But the numbers in her letters were correct. The proposals were sound. Her reforms cost less than a single London dinner he had once attended without tasting the food. Worse still, they were humane. That word followed him into the night after Mr. Pierce departed. Humane. Everett poured coffee, let it cool, and did not drink it. Near midnight, he opened Samuel's latest letter, though he already knew doing so would disturb him. "Your Grace, the Duchess has ordered the blue parlor restored for household use and has authorized repairs to the servants' hall. She receives local tradesmen with dignity and firmness. Lady Marjorie Vale called yesterday. Her Grace handled the visit with admirable composure. The old rooms are changing, sir. I had not thought to see such light again." Everett's hand tightened. Lady Marjorie. That name brought a different coldness. Marjorie Vale had been Lydia's closest companion in the months before the accident, too present, too informed, always near the edges of private grief. Everett had never trusted her pity. He trusted it even less now. He set Samuel's letter down, but one line held him. "I had not thought to see such light again." In his mind, unwillingly, Blackridge appeared, not as he had left it, shuttered and obedient to sorrow, but with curtains drawn back, fireplaces woken, footsteps crossing rooms that had slept for years. And at the center of it, Clara. A woman he had abandoned to silence, answering not with tears, but with keys. Everett closed his eyes. For one treacherous moment, he imagined the East Conservatory under candlelight. Then he opened them quickly, as if memory itself had come too close. "No," he whispered to the empty room. But by morning, When another letter arrived from Ashbourne Cove addressed not to him but to Her Grace, Duchess of Blackridge, Everett understood the truth he had been resisting. His wife's name was reaching places his own had failed to reach for years. And Blackridge, the house he had left behind as a monument to loss, had begun speaking without his permission. The morning Clara unlocked the east conservatory, the sea was calm enough to seem innocent. No gull cried over the cliffs. No storm pressed its shoulder against the windows. Even the fog had lifted, leaving Blackridge Castle exposed beneath a hard silver sky, every tower and chimney drawn with unforgiving clarity. Clara stood at the end of the east corridor with the blackened key in her palm while Samuel waited 10 feet behind her, silent as a witness at a service for the dead. "You need not do this today, Your Grace," he said. Clara looked at the tall glass doors, their iron vines dark with age, their panes clouded by salt and years of refusal. Beyond them, the white camellia waited in its cracked pot, small and stubborn, the only bright thing in a room everyone had surrendered. "That is exactly why I must." The key resisted at first. Metal complained against metal. Then the lock turned with a sound so sharp it seemed to travel through the bones of the house. Clara pushed the door open. Cold air breathed out, carrying the scent of dry soil, old leaves, rust, and something faintly sweet that had survived where it should not have. Inside, the conservatory stretched along the eastern wall of the castle, its glass roof streaked with gray, its long tables bowed under empty pots, its stone floor littered with fallen petals that had become dust long ago. Clara stepped carefully, her skirts brushing dead stems. Samuel remained at the threshold. "She spent hours here," he said, his voice low. "Miss Fairchild believed even northern houses deserved spring." Clara touched the rim of a planter where salt had crusted like pale frost. "Then she was right." Near the back wall stood a cabinet sealed with a different lock, smaller than the others and nearly hidden behind a curtain of brittle vines. Clara might have missed it had the living camellia not stood beside it like a quiet guard. "What is that?" Samuel's expression changed. Not fear exactly. Recognition. "I do not know, Your Grace." It was the first lie he had told her. Gently, Clara turned to him. "Samuel." His shoulders lowered, as if the weight of a decade had finally found the floor. "His Grace ordered that cabinet sealed after Miss Lydia died. He never opened it again. Was it hers? Perhaps. Or perhaps it contains things he could not bear to understand." Clara tried the small drawer beneath the cabinet. Unlocked. Inside lay a packet of papers wrapped in faded blue ribbon, a ribbon the color of old summer skies. She did not open it quickly. Some truths deserved manners. The first pages were accounts, but not household accounts. Harbor transfers. Private notes. Land agreements. Letters written in a narrow, slanted hand she did not recognize. Names repeated across them: Whitmore, Fairchild, Vale, and one more, Lord Calvin Whitmore, Everett's cousin and nearest male relative after the direct line. Clara read standing at first. Then she sat on an overturned garden stool as the meaning gathered itself in pieces. Lydia Fairchild had not simply left Blackridge after an argument. She had discovered irregular debts tied to land near Ashbourne Cove. Someone had been moving money through fishing leases, squeezing tenants, hiding losses behind the ducal name. Lydia had intended to tell Everett. One letter, unfinished, was addressed to him. "My dearest Everett, I fear your trust has been used against you. Do not dismiss this as nerves. The ledgers do not agree. Lady Marjorie knows more than she has said, and your cousin has pressed me to remain silent for the good of the family. I cannot. If I leave tonight, it will only be to place these copies somewhere safe." Clara's fingers stilled. No violence lay on the page. No brutal detail. Only fear written with restraint, and restraint made it worse. Samuel had turned pale. "I never saw that." Clara believed him. Grief had many servants, but secrecy had different hands. She continued reading until one receipt made her breath pause, a payment to a driver for a late-night carriage route along the Eastern Cliff Road, signed with the initials C. W., Lord Calvin Whitmore. Beneath it, in Lydia's hand, was one sentence: "If anything happens before I speak, this was not an accident of weather." The conservatory seemed to tilt around Clara. Outside the glass, the Atlantic flashed under the morning light, beautiful and pitiless. For 9 years, Everett had blamed himself, the house, love, fate, anything wide enough to contain pain. Yet hidden behind dead vines and locked glass was the possibility that his grief had been shaped by another person's greed. Clara folded the papers with hands that remained steady only because she demanded it of them. "These must be sent to His Grace," Samuel whispered. "Not yet." He stared at her. Clara rose, the blue ribbon clenched between her fingers. "If Lord Calvin or Lady Marjorie learns we have found this before we understand all of it, the truth may vanish again." At that moment, something tapped softly against the conservatory door. Clara turned. A folded note lay just inside the corridor, as if slipped beneath the outer door while they stood among the old flowers. Samuel crossed to retrieve it, but Clara reached it first. The paper held no seal. Only one line, written in plain black ink. "Leave the dead where they are, Duchess, or Blackridge will lose the only light it has left." Clara looked from the note to the white camellia, still alive beside the opened cabinet. Her heart beat once. Then again. Not with panic. With purpose. "No," she said quietly. "The dead have waited long enough." By the time the next storm came, Clara had learned that Blackridge did not fear thunder. It feared change. All afternoon, the sky over the Maine coast darkened by degrees, from pewter to iron to a deep bruised blue, while the Atlantic rose in restless folds against the cliffs below. The fishermen of Ashbourne Cove knew the signs before the first bell rang. Boats pulled hard against their ropes. Women hurried children indoors. Old men stood at the harbor wall and watched the horizon with faces carved by weather and memory. At Blackridge, Clara stood in the west study with Lydia's papers locked in the lower drawer of Everett's desk, the threatening note folded beneath them, and Samuel beside her looking 10 years older than he had the week before. "The barometer is falling quickly, Your Grace," he said. "The lower road may flood before night." Clara closed the ledger before her. "Then we open the great hall." Samuel blinked. "To whom?" "To anyone who cannot safely remain below." For one full second, the old rules of the house rose between them. No crowds, no noise, no village feet on ducal stone, no life too close to grief. Then Samuel bowed. Not reluctantly. Deeply. "At once, Your Grace." By sunset, Blackridge Castle was no longer silent. Footsteps filled the corridors. Lanterns moved through the fog. Mrs. Alder ordered soup kettles onto the kitchen fires while maids carried blankets from cedar chests that had not been opened in years. Thomas Reed and the footmen brought in benches from the chapel room. Clara moved among them with her sleeves pinned back, her pale face calm beneath the lamplight, giving instructions without raising her voice. The great hall, once a museum of covered furniture, became a shelter. Fishermen entered with rain shining on their coats. Mothers came with children wrapped in shawls. An elderly couple from the harbor road was seated nearest the fire. No one laughed at first. They looked up at the portraits, at the black rafters, at the Duchess standing beneath the staircase, and seemed uncertain whether they had been rescued or summoned before judgment. Clara understood. She took a basket of bread from Mrs. Alder and began serving it herself. After that, the room exhaled. Quietly. Humanly. Outside, wind struck the castle hard enough to rattle the western windows. Inside, candles multiplied. The chapel bell, loosened by the gale, rang once without a hand upon it, a low bronze sound that made several children go still. Clara knelt beside a little girl whose cheeks were red from cold and offered her a cup of warm cider. "What is your name?" she asked. "Annie Reed," the child whispered. "Thomas Reed's younger sister." Clara smiled. "Then, Annie Reed, tonight you are a guest of Blackridge." The girl looked around the vast hall. "Does the castle mind?" Clara glanced toward the covered furniture pushed against the walls, toward the awakened hearth, toward Samuel directing footmen with solemn pride. No, she said softly. I think the castle has been waiting. Near 9 o'clock, Lady Marjorie Vale arrived without invitation, wrapped in a traveling cloak of dark green wool, her silver hair pinned perfectly despite the weather. She paused at the entrance, as though the sight offended some private law of nature. My dear Duchess, she said, her voice carrying above the murmur of the hall, you have turned Blackridge into a public inn. Several villagers lowered their eyes. Clara did not. No, Lady Marjorie. An inn charges those in need. Blackridge will not. A faint color rose beneath Marjorie's powder. His Grace will be astonished when he hears of this. Then perhaps astonishment will do him good. The words were mild. The room heard them anyway. For the first time, someone in the back of the hall gave a small laugh, quickly covered, but not erased. Marjorie's gaze sharpened, and in it Clara saw the same chill that had lived inside the unsigned note. Not proof. Not yet. But recognition passed between them like a candle held too near dry paper. Then the front doors opened again. Not with drama. With weight. Wind drove rain across the threshold, and every candle near the entrance bent low. A tall man stood there in a dark traveling coat, his black hair damp from the storm, his face severe from the journey, his gray eyes taking in the hall, the villagers, the fires, the servants, the candles, the bread in Clara's hands. Duke Everett Whitmore had come home. The room fell into a silence so complete that even the storm seemed to step back from the windows. Clara rose slowly from beside Annie Reed. For the first time since the chapel where they had spoken their vows, husband and wife faced each other beneath the roof that had belonged to him, and had somehow learned to breathe through her. Everett did not speak at once. His gaze moved from the open hearths to the uncovered furniture, from Samuel standing proudly among the villagers to Lady Marjorie watching with tightened lips, and finally to Clara. She wore no jewels. No grand silk. Only a grey dress darkened at the hem from work and weather, a candle flame reflected in her steady eyes. He had expected disorder. Excess. Sentiment. Instead, he saw shelter. He saw loyalty. He saw his name being used for mercy where he had only used it for distance. At last, his voice came low and roughened by something he did not know how to name. What has happened to my house? Clara held his gaze. Around them, the people of Ashbourne Cove waited, not for the Duke, but for her. It remembered what it was built for, she said. And in the high gallery above them, where Lydia Fairchild's veiled portrait hung, the cloth stirred in the wind from the open door as if the past itself had heard. Everett did not remove his gloves for several minutes. He stood inside the great hall as rain slid from the shoulders of his traveling coat and gathered in dark drops on the marble floor, watching Blackridge Castle behave like a place he no longer recognized. Children slept beneath folded quilts near the hearth. Fishermen warmed their hands around mugs of broth. Mrs. Alder moved through the room with a basket of bread as if feeding strangers in a ducal hall had always been proper. Samuel, faithful Samuel, whose silence had guarded Everett's grief for 9 long years, stood beside Clara with the calm expression of a man who had chosen where his loyalty now wished to breathe. The realization struck Everett with more force than anger could explain. He had left a wife in his house. He had returned to find a Duchess in command of it. Lady Marjorie was the first to move toward him, her face arranged into concern. Your Grace, thank heaven you have returned. I feared no one would tell you what liberties had been taken in your absence. Clara said nothing. That unsettled him more than defense would have. She simply stood with the bread basket in her hands, her gown damp at the hem, her hair loosened slightly by work and storm, her eyes steady but not pleading. Everett looked at Marjorie. Liberties? The servants' wing altered, the village brought inside, the lower stores opened without your approval, old rooms disturbed. I only worry, of course, for the dignity of Blackridge. The word dignity sounded polished and hollow in the candlelit hall. Before Everett could answer, little Annie Reed, half asleep near the fire, murmured, The Duchess gave my grandmother the warm chair. A few villagers lowered their heads, afraid the child had spoken out of turn. Everett looked toward the elderly woman wrapped in a Blackridge blanket, then back at Clara. Something in his chest tightened, not gently. "The storm blocked the harbor road," Clara said at last. "Several homes below the cliff were unsafe for the night. The great hall was dry. The fires were available. I used them. You used my house without writing for permission." "Yes." No excuse. No trembling. Only truth. "Would you have preferred I waited while people stood in the rain?" The question moved through the hall quietly, touching every witness. Everett felt it fine the man he had been before grief made rules in place of judgment. He remembered, unwillingly, his father saying that a title was not a jewel but a roof one was born responsible to hold. He had forgotten that. Or chosen to. Lady Marjorie stepped closer, lowering her voice but not enough to keep others from hearing. "Your Grace, she is young. Her intentions may be sweet, but sentiment can weaken authority. If every tenant learns that tears open castle doors, what then?" Everett's eyes narrowed. "Did you see tears?" Marjorie faltered. He turned back to Clara. "I see work." Silence sharpened. The remark was not praise exactly, but it was not condemnation, and in that room it landed like a door unlatched. Marjorie's mouth tightened. "Then you approve?" Everett did not answer her. His gaze had moved to the high gallery, where Lydia Fairchild's veiled portrait stirred faintly whenever the wind reached the rafters. For years, he had not allowed himself to stand beneath it. Now he stood there surrounded by light Clara had brought into rooms he had condemned to darkness. "Samuel," he said, "see that the villagers are housed safely until the road clears." Samuel bowed. "Yes, Your Grace." Marjorie drew herself up. "I shall leave you to your domestic revolution." "No," Clara said softly. The word stopped everyone, including Everett. Clara set the bread basket on the nearest table and crossed the hall with measured steps. Not toward Marjorie. Toward the staircase. "There is something His Grace must see first." Everett's face hardened at once. "Clara." It was the first time he had spoken her name since their vows. It sounded unfamiliar in his mouth, too intimate for strangers, too late for husband and wife. Clara paused at the foot of the stairs. "You may refuse me after you understand what has been hidden from you." Marjorie went very still. Everett saw it. A flicker. Small. Human. Afraid. For 9 years he had trusted grief because grief asked nothing new of him. But Clara asked him to climb the stairs. To look. To enter what he had sealed. Every instinct in him resisted. Yet the hall was watching, and more than the hall. The house itself seemed to wait. He removed his gloves slowly and handed them to Samuel. "Lead the way." The east corridor received them with a coldness even the storm could not explain. Clara walked ahead carrying a candle. Everett followed, his steps slowing as they approached the glass doors of the conservatory. The air smelled of salt, dust, and living green. Living. That alone nearly stopped him. Clara opened the door. Inside, candles burned along the old planting tables. Dead vines had been cleared from half the room. Fresh soil waited in new pots. And beside the rear cabinet stood the white camellia, small, impossible, alive. Everett stared at it as if it had spoken Lydia's name. Clara took the blue ribbon packet from beneath her shawl and held it out. "She left you the truth," she said. "Someone made certain you would only inherit the grief." Everett did not take the papers at first. His hand hovered unsteady for the first time Clara had ever seen. Then he accepted them. As he read, the years seemed to leave his face and return differently, not as youth, but as pain finally given a shape. In the corridor behind them, Lady Marjorie's footsteps faded. Too late. Samuel was already there. So were 2 footmen at the hall door. Everett looked up from Lydia's unfinished letter, and when his eyes found Clara, they held no warmth yet. Warmth would come later, if it came at all. What stood there first was something more important. Respect. "I gave you nothing," he said, his voice low. Clara looked at the awakened room, the candlelight, the flower that had survived being forgotten. "No," she answered. You gave me ruins. I chose not to become one. By dawn, the storm had moved out over the Atlantic, leaving Ashbourne Cove washed clean beneath a pale gold sky. Blackridge Castle stood above the cliffs with every eastern window catching light, as if the house had opened its eyes after years of refusing morning. Everett did not sleep. He spent the last hours of night in the conservatory with Lydia's papers spread across the long planting table, reading each letter, receipt, and account until grief could no longer protect him from truth. Lord Calvin Whitmore had used the ducal name to hide debts, pressure tenants, and weaken the estate from within. Lady Marjorie Vale had known enough to remain dangerous, enough to guide suspicion away from herself, enough to smile at funerals and tea tables while silence did her work. There was no need for ugly spectacle. Truth, when arranged properly, could stand without shouting. At 8 o'clock, Everett ordered the chapel opened. Not the grand chapel used for ceremonies, but the old stone room beside the east garden, where rainwater had once gathered in a silver bowl and Clara had ordered the roof repaired before the altar cloth. The villagers remained at Blackridge because the lower road was still muddy and unsafe. The servants gathered because Samuel asked them, though they would have come for Clara without asking. Lady Marjorie was present because Everett sent a carriage to the guest lodge where she had attempted to wait out the storm with dignity intact. Lord Calvin arrived shortly after, smiling with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to being welcomed by inheritance before character. His smile faded when he saw the papers on the chapel table. Clara stood beside Everett, not behind him. She wore a dark blue gown borrowed from the wardrobe she had barely touched since her marriage, simple and high at the throat, her hair pinned plainly, her face calm. Everett noticed, with a pain that humbled him, that she looked like the first honest thing Blackridge had held in years. He addressed the room without raising his voice. He spoke of financial irregularities, forged instructions, concealed pressure upon Lydia Fairchild, and evidence hidden in the East Conservatory. He did not dress the truth in rage. He gave it shape. He gave it witnesses. Lord Calvin protested. Lady Marjorie denied. But denial sounded thin against paper, signatures, dates, and Samuel's steady testimony that the cabinet had been sealed by Everett before anyone searched it. When the county magistrate, summoned from Portland at Everett's request before sunrise, accepted the packet for formal inquiry, the chapel remained silent. No one cheered. The moment was too solemn for triumph. It was not victory over death. It was release from a lie. Lord Calvin left under guard of law, not violence. Lady Marjorie followed in pale silence, her green cloak drawn tight, her eyes avoiding Clara as though the young Duchess had become a mirror she could not bear. When the doors closed behind them, Everett turned toward the veiled portrait that had been brought from the gallery at his command. For a long moment, he only looked at it. Then he reached up and removed the black cloth. Lydia Fairchild's painted face appeared in morning light, young, bright, and no longer treated like a wound that must be hidden to be honored. Everett bowed his head. "I am sorry," he whispered. Clara heard the words, but did not move closer. Some grief needed space before it could accept comfort. The day passed slowly, with the strange gentleness that follows a long-held breath. Villagers returned to Ashbourne Cove with blankets, bread, and stories their grandchildren would one day think exaggerated. The servants uncovered the last of the furniture in the great hall. Thomas Reed polished the banister until it shone. Mrs. Alder placed fresh bread on the long dining table and cried again when no one told her to stop. By evening, the castle was quiet, but not dead. Everett found Clara in the conservatory, kneeling beside the white camellia with a small copper watering can in her hand. He stopped at the door, as if entering required permission now. "May I come in?" he asked. Clara looked over her shoulder. For a heartbeat, she was the bride in the cold chamber again. Then the heartbeat passed. "Yes." He crossed the room slowly, every step measured by memory. "I thought I was preserving what I had lost," he said. "I was only preserving the loss." Clara set the watering can down. "Grief can become a house if one lives inside it too long." Everett looked at her then, truly looked, not at the title he had given her, not at the convenience she had been meant to represent, but at the woman who had read his neglect, endured his absence, opened his locked rooms, and answered his emptiness with life. I cannot ask forgiveness as though one apology repairs what I did. No, Clara said gently. It does not. The honesty should have wounded him. Instead, it steadied him. Then let me begin with respect. He lowered himself to one knee on the stone floor, not like a man performing romance for witnesses, but like one surrendering pride where pride had failed him. Clara Whitmore, Duchess of Blackridge, this house is yours not because I left it to you, but because you became worthy of it while I was unworthy of returning. Her eyes softened, not with easy love, but with something quieter and more lasting. The first door of a future, not the whole room. Stand, Everett, she said. A house cannot be rebuilt by one person kneeling. He rose. Together, they turned toward the glass roof where the last light of evening gathered up,